I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Farm Office Live here on June 25th, almost to July, and we'd like to welcome you back on behalf of OSU Extension, welcome you back to Farm Office Live. And in today's session, we are pleased to bring you a whole host of topics again, including we're going to have a special guest on CAUV. We're going to talk about Dicamba legislation and including some newly BEAR discussion, Prop 12, CARES Act, the CFAP program sign up update, as well as some renewable fuel standards and the ARC PLC program sign up here is finishing, and then anything else that may come up as we go through discussion. And just a reminder, as our farm office team from left to right, Diane Shoemaker, Barry Ward, Ben Brown, myself, David Marrison, Peggy Hall, and Julie Stawser. And today we have a special guest as well. Just a few housekeeping items. On each of your screens, you will see a chat box, and we encourage you as we go through. We have everybody muted, but if you have questions as we go through, don't hesitate to drop those in the chat box or the Q&A box. And we will be monitoring this as a team, and we'll be answering those as we go through in our normal pattern through today's Zoom webinar. So again, I'd just like to thank you for being on this morning. And I mentioned that we're going to have a special guest, and we're going to kick off right with our special guest because this is some news that I think a few of you across the state saw. A report was released here this past month, during this month, and it was on one of our most lovely topics that we love to talk about is CAUV, the current agriculture use valuation update. And Robert Dinterman, a postdoc researcher from our Department of Agriculture, Environmental and Development Economics, is joining us this morning. So Robert, we welcome you to the Farm Office Live webinar. And if you want to say a few words, and I'm gonna switch over to your slides as we do that. So welcome, Bob.
Thank you, David. Thanks for having me today. I know people are certainly interested in CAUV, so pretty excited to talk about this, even though it may be sometimes thought of as a boring topic.
Never boring when we talk about taxes.
Right.
Look at Barry's smile. We finally got a smile out of Barry today. And I trust everyone can see your slides, Bob, and we'll go from there.
Cool. So what I'll be talking about is CAUV's projection for 2020, which will be released officially from Ohio Department of Taxation, I believe later on this month at some point in time. So we put together projections for 2020, 2021, and 2022. So David, we just want to jump into what the highlights of our report ended up finding. The highlights of our report kind of are mostly, we're going to see a drop in the average CAUV value for 2020. So this year we're going to have about half of the state's counties are going to be receiving new CAUV values. These half of the state is going to be receiving some sort of a reappraisal or an adjustment to all of their property taxes. So your buildings, commercial, real estate, land, as well as the CAUV program. So 2020 is kind of unique in that there was large legislation changes in 2017 to how CAUV would be calculated. That mostly dealt with how you look at the capitalization rate in the CAUV formula. So that's really just talking about what interest rate goes into the formula for calculating your CAV values. And 2017 was when that change happened, but in 2017, 2018, and 2019, there was what was called a phase-in period. And so it wasn't going to be the full value of the new calculation. It was going to be only half of the change. 2020, we get the full change, and with the full change, we're going to see pretty large drop on average for CAUV values. So currently, we're looking at about $665 on average for CAUV in 2020. If you look at just how this interacts with last year. Last year we had CAUV values on average of $873 in updates. However, landowners only receive new CAUV values once every 3 years, so once every triennial adjustment. So of the half of the state that's going to be receiving new CAUV values this year, the appropriate way to look at it is go back to 2017 and what was the CAUV values in 2017 and kind of how does that change from 2020. So we're looking at about a 40% drop in this average CAUV value from 2017 to 2020. So in 2017, the average CAUV value was 1,153. So with a 665 roughly, I mean, we're close to kind of half of a full reduction. That's the good news. Kind of in the background, though, what's kind of good news as well, or at least it's not terrible news. Whenever we look forward in terms of projecting what should CAUV values kind of be doing into the future, so what should we look like for 2021 and 2022? This is just, it's in our report if you want to know kind of the nitty gritty details of how we're actually projecting things forward, but we're anticipating in 2021 we'll have about an average of $760 on average for CAUV values in 2021. So you can kind of realize, oh, okay, so this is going to start to increase from 2020 to 2021. We're going to start to see a little bit of the increase in CAUVs kind of popping back up. There is a little bit of a range for what this value could be. So it could technically in 2021 be as low as $560 on average or as high as $900 on average. I wouldn't anticipate that. We've been pretty accurate for all of our projections in the past. So in 2021, we're going to start to see a little bit of an increase up to 760. 2022, we'll probably see another increase kind of up to about 880. And in the background, what you should also be thinking of in terms of 2021, what counties are going to be receiving their updates. Well, that's going to be actually like a 25% drop from the last triennial update. So they'll still be receiving kind of an actual benefit. When you look at 2022, this is where we're actually anticipating that's probably the range that we're going to settle on for average CAUV values kind of going forward. So in 2022, we're anticipating $880 on average for CAUV values. And if you look at that kind of what happened with the previous triennial update for them, which is another kind of way of saying last year we had an average of $873 for CAUV values. That is going to be in place for kind of three tax cycles. And in 2022, that's when it's going to be replaced. And we'll kind of be back in that spot. So David, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll actually kind of talk about what's really kind of going on in the background for these changes in CAUV values kind of going on. Not to go into too much detail for how CAUV is calculated, but a CAUV value will be put in place for every single soil type in Ohio. So whenever you're looking at what type of property tax you should be receiving on your soil type, for CAUV values, it's based off of what your soil is, and in the background, it actually just matters what was the expected yields that it's going to have for corn, soybeans, and wheat, and that kind of puts the basis for how you calculate CAUV values. There's really major components of it is going to be what we would consider estimating your net operating income on said soil type, and when you estimate your net operating income on said soil type, you need to know what's your revenues and what's your costs. So for one of the components of CAUV, you're looking at the non-land costs. This is some of for Ohio Department of Taxation, when they put together their CAUV values, they actually use Barry's budgets for kind of putting in an estimate for what this non-land cost should be for each tax year. In general, non-land costs have been kind of declining since 2015. There was certainly a larger drop between 2015 and 2016, but it's going to be something that kind of continues kind of going forward into the future. Of non-land costs are trending slightly downward. What actually goes into the CAUV values is you take an Olympic average of the past 7 years for for the non-land costs. So one component is non-land costs are projected to kind of continue to slightly decrease. When your non-land costs go down, that's actually putting upward pressure or increasing your CAUV values. On another component side is CAUV will use the prices that that a typical farmer in Ohio is going to receive for corn, soybeans, and wheat. We're projecting that's going to actually be a little bit of a stagnating effect. When you look at what of the prices for corn, soybeans, and wheat go into the CAUV formula, the CAUV formula is going to use the past 8 years and an Olympic average of the past years, although they don't include the current year. So what's kind of happening in the background for kind of changing prices in the CAUV formula is we had high prices in 2012 and 2013 for corn, soybeans, and wheat. Those are going to drop out of calculations in 2020 and then onward. And so what's been happening is if you look at the past 8 years for what's going to be your typical corn, soybean, wheat type price, it's kind of a stagnated value. So we're going to kind of continue to see kind of a stagnated price component. So prices are going to drop for this year in the CAUV formula, which is going to put downward pressure on CAUV, but that drop's not really expected to decrease even further because we're not really having kind of even lower values kind of popping into the prices. And really what was happening is just we had high prices that were being calculated in 2012 and 2013 that are dropping out. Another component that's kind of just a stagnating component for CAUV, yields kind of go in the background. There's an adjustment to yields in the CAUV formula. We're just anticipating a continued 30-year kind of trend line upward. So slow increases in yields are going to be slowly pushing up the CAUV values into the future. And that's been the case, though, for a long period of time anyway. And then the last, probably the most important aspect of CAUV values kind of going forward is what's going to be looking at our capitalization rate. And so capitalization rate is you're going to be looking at the interest rates kind of received for farmland in Ohio, as well as kind of what's your equity appreciation rate on farmland. This is a component where what we're seeing is Federal Reserve policy is certainly pushing downward pressure on the capitalization rate in terms of interest rates are being kind of lowered at the moment, mostly due to kind of large macroeconomic effects. And so that's going to trickle into the interest rates received for farmers on farmland, and that's going to be dropping. And where this kind of puts a little bit of a concern is the capitalization rate in the CAUV formula. CAUV formula is effectively going to be your net operating income divided by your capitalization rate to give you a present value, or just kind of an expected, what should the agricultural use value of these soil types be. So with downward pressure on the capitalization rate, that's actually going to be pushing upward pressure on future CAUV values. Now, we've kind of been in a low value for these interest rates for a while. And so there's going to be a little bit of downward pressure kind of putting on the capitalization rate, but it's not going to be something that we're going to have a large scale change that's going to happen. So those are kind of how our projections kind of look into the future. David, if you want to go to kind of a graph of kind of looking at what these expectations are. So because CAUV is assigned to each soil type, it's very hard to then kind of conceptualize what an actual farmer or landowner is going to be receiving for kind of any changes to these CAUV values. Each soil type in Ohio, for that Ohio Department of Taxation assigns CAUV values for, they assign a productivity index in the background with them. So all we've done is kind of grouped along your soil type by productivity index, and that's just going to be measuring out kind of the expected yields in the background. And so the large bolded line should be what the average across all soil types in Ohio ends up being. And here you can just see the long-term trends. So the black vertical line is where you have official Ohio Department of Taxation values, and this is kind of what we've seen in the past. And then to the right, or kind of further onward of the black vertical line, is our projections. Here you can kind of also see the stagnation in CAUV values that we had before 2006. 2006, there was the update to how yields are calculated within the CAV formula. That started to put a little bit of upward pressure on CAV values. Then around 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, we started to get the high price environment and also a low interest rate environment. And that really started to skyrocket up these CAV values. So whenever we're looking into the future for 2021 and 2022, this is going to be kind of similar to what values farmlands operated were seeing around, I don't know, 2012 is probably about kind of the right point in time. So David, if you wanted to go to the actual values for the next slide, if in case anyone wanted to know, instead of looking at it graphically, what were the literal values for kind of what we're looking at. You can see that whenever you look at the high soil quality in Ohio, those are going to be highly expensive, well, highly priced for CAUV values over time. Those are also going to be typically, those are going to typically be the soils that see the largest change. So whenever we put together our projections of saying that we're going to see roughly a 40% decline in average CAUV value, that 40% decline is probably going to be actually larger for more productive soils. So more productive soils are probably going to see a larger than 40% decline. And that's actually because there's a large amount of soils in Ohio that are bound to the minimum. So anything below a 50 productivity index in Ohio is going to be assigned the minimum value for CAUV. And currently that's going to be $350. And so David, if you just wanted to kind of, I'll close out by just kind of pointing out on the next slide what counties are actually seeing CAUV updates. So this is just state of Ohio map. 2020 is going to be your purplish colored. So here in Franklin County, where I am, that's where we're going to see changes to CAUV values, as well as other properties across Franklin County are going to be receiving these updates. So that's what we kind of have going forward. Like I said, Ohio Department of Taxation is going to come out with the official 2020 values at some point in time later this month. Although we've been fairly accurate to what their actual values end up being. The last 2 years, we were within $1 of their actual values. 2021 and 2022 are going to be a little bit more uncertain, but certainly the large-scale trend of CAUV values kicking back up a little bit in 2021 and 22, that's certainly going to happen. It's probably not going to be any sort of spike that we saw in 2013, 14 kind of range. That would, the way that the capitalization rate is currently calculated is going to kind of bar that situation from ever happening again.
Bob, we had one question come in through the chat box or the Q&A about getting access to your slides. How can people get more information or maybe access to the slides, or would you direct them to the report? What's the best mode for that?
So kind of two ways. These slides are online. A lot of them are actually just kind of taken straight out of the report. But actually, all of this is on open source on GitHub. So actually, if you go to robertdinnerman.com/CAUV, that's where we put all of our projections, all of our kind of way that we put together the data for particular soil types and whatnot. That's where they'll live. They actually live in code on GitHub.
And this link okay if we add that, and we'll add some to the chat box as well for the report.
Yep, that would work as well.
Okay.
The reports also should be on AEDE as well.
Yep, and we will dump that in the chat box. One of my trusty colleagues will dump that into the chat box. Thank you, Chris, for that suggestion to make sure everyone is able to see that. So great. Are there other questions for Robert? So on the good news from where we were, coming back down from those highs, and looks like if I heard you right, probably more similar to those values from 2012 from 8 years ago. So a little moderation back down.
Yeah, and so a big point of that is just so Farm Bureau put through legislation that was passed in 2017, and that was just kind of a way to make sure that the capitalization rate is calculated based off of a data source that's used from the USDA. Before 2017, part of the calculation for the capitalization rate was actually through the federal funds rate. So the federal funds rate is not actually going to tell you farm specific appreciation of capital. And so that was just a little bit on the problematic side. And that was really why you started to see the capitalization rate start to tank massively and why CAUV values really started to rise. It was partly that, and then also partly because prices were high. So that was also, I'm very certain that farmers across Ohio would be happy if their CAUV values rose in the future, because that's going to imply prices started to rebound.
Great. Well, Robert, we just are very thrilled that you were able to come on today, join us as a guest, and in the chat box, Ben has already put the link to the slides, but also I think more importantly, that access to that report, and that report is there from AEDE that's up on the website, so you're able to click on that and be able to take a look at that directly for the people on there. So thank you, Bob, for being on this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
With that, we're going to transition to, legal issues. And we like to vary this. You never know what's coming next, but Dicamba's been in the news, Bears in the news. So Peggy, we're going to drop it your way to give us an update on where are we on Dicamba. You've been writing some great articles that are on the Farm Office website here over the past 3 weeks. So we're going to bounce it to you to give us an update.
Okay, thank you, David. Yes, where are we with Dicamba? Well, we have about 5 days of Dicamba use left in Ohio now. There was an attempt previously to shorten that time and cease all Dicamba use across the country, but that was not successful. And that's point one there on the slide, an emergency motion that was filed by the plaintiffs in the Dicamba litigation regarding registration of those 3 Dicamba products. The EPA, as you know, as we discussed in our last Farm Office Live, issued a cancellation order that would allow continuation of use of existing stocks until July 30th. But here in Ohio, the registration of those products ends June 30th. And so ODA had clarified that Ohio producers could use existing stocks until June 30th. But that was immediately put into question when the emergency motion was filed by the plaintiffs. But the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal addressed that motion and decided that it would not cease use and would allow EPA's cancellation order to stand. So here in Ohio, we still have until June 30th to use those existing stocks. In other parts of the country, they may have up until July 30th, but there's a lot of variation from state to state, depending on some of these state issues like registration. Some states have actually ceased all use. So here in Ohio, we're allowing it until June 30th. But that's not the end of this case. There was a lot of activity last week in the case before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And so the court addressed several other motions that were before it. In addition to this emergency motion, there was a request by CropLife America and American Farm Bureau Federation, representing a number of commodity groups, to seek status as a friend of the court, amicus status in that case. And the court granted those requests, and then those groups immediately filed motions supporting EPA's cancellation order. And I'm sure we'll continue to be involved in the rest of the case. And then importantly, there were 2 motions by BASF and DuPont as the makers of 2 of those products to intervene in the case. They were not parties. The original party was Monsanto or Bayer, and it's a long history, but at some point the issue in the case changed from just the Monsanto-based product to these other 2 Dicamba products, and yet those companies didn't realize that the scope of the order would address their products. And so they're now saying, we didn't have a chance to be heard in this case, so we now want the right to intervene. And the court did grant that right of intervention to both of them. And then BASF immediately filed a motion then to recall that original order that the Ninth Circuit made that canceled the registration of those 3 products. So the court then requested briefs from the parties, and as you can see there, those were just due just early this week, the 23rd and 24th. And so now what we're waiting on is a decision by the court on BASF's motion to completely recall that registration vacation. So we will see if that happens and how the court rules on that. I expect it will rule pretty quickly, since it set up a pretty tight briefing schedule there and has had those briefs now for a good day. So we might see something this Friday that addresses those motions. A lot there on Dicamba. Any questions, David, that I can answer on that?
No, Peggy, I don't think we've gotten any questions through there, but there's something else that has come out with Bayer too, right? A settlement. We can go there and see if this just gives us some questions on both of these issues.
Right, and that just came out yesterday, the announcement by Bayer regarding quite a few settlements. Now, they did clarify that none of this was driven by the Ninth Circuit Dicamba registration decision. They stated that they already had all of these settlements in process and they were not affected by the Ninth Circuit's decision in that. But the first part of the settlement does deal with Dicamba drift litigation. As many of you are probably aware, there have been a number of cases filed in regards to drift, and a big one that occurred down in Georgia with a peach farm that received a huge verdict in that case. Well, Bayer announced as part of this huge settlement package yesterday that they were going to settle those cases. Now, the Georgia peach farm case is not part of that. It is going to be appealed, actually, and they said that they will continue to press that appeal because they don't believe that they should be responsible for that drift. But they are going to settle the other cases, and that's about $400 million worth of litigation against them on the issue of drift. But the biggest portion of the settlement announcement yesterday deals with the Roundup product liability cases, and there are a number of those. 3 of those have gone through successfully and very much in favor of the plaintiffs, who are claiming that Roundup has caused their non-Hodgkin lymphoma cancer. And so the settlement in this case will deal with the 125,000 or so claims currently involved in that Roundup product liability litigation. There's a number of class actions and multi-district litigation type litigation going on in that case. So it will resolve those, and basically all of those plaintiffs who are involved in those claims will be part of that settlement. There are some that are still yet to be determined if there's even a valid claim. And so $1.25 billion has been set aside to deal with those potential future claims that may yet emerge from this litigation. So we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of $9 billion that will go to the existing claims, another 1.25 to future claims. And what's interesting about that future claim issue is that Bayer proposes setting up basically a science court that will be composed of 5 scientific experts who will dig deeper into this issue of whether Roundup actually does cause the non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And that science panel, as they're calling it, will determine how to resolve those future claims. So they will oversee that 1.25 billion and those future claims coming before it. And based upon their scientific, their scientific exploration further into this issue of causation, then they will determine whether any of those future claims are valid and should be paid out of that fund. So that one's pretty interesting. We've not seen something like this before, where a science panel stands in and takes the place of a jury. So something to watch to see what happens with that. And then finally, there's some old PCB litigation hanging around that Bayer also inherited when it bought Monsanto. Monsanto quit manufacturing PCBs back in the late 70s, but there has still been litigation from states that have been impacted by that PCB manufacturing. And so that's part of this settlement as well. Those parties will divvy up about 820 million in that part of the settlement. So that's what's going on with Bayer. I think we'll continue to see more and more details about the settlement. It is yet to be confirmed, of course, by the court. So the court will have to approve it, but Bayer has been pretty forthright in sharing information about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And that's probably likely to be approved by the court.
Great. And Peggy, we haven't had any questions pop in yet, but we had a question that came as a result of Sarah Nagel's breakfast coffee shop up in Northwest Ohio. And that question was, could you talk about a little bit about California's Proposition 12? And if we can, we'll move to that, because that's something that you've been keeping an eye on, but also our producers here in Ohio are keeping an eye on it, that it may impact us. So what's this all about?
Sure. You know, I've been thinking that if I wanted to go to private practice, I could go into litigation. There's a lot of litigation going on these days in the ag world, maybe a little more than is typical, but this is a case. And California tends to, be a proposition-oriented state. You could probably maintain a full-time job just keeping up with all of California's propositions, but they did pass a proposition. David, if you would go to the next slide, Proposition 12 back in 2018. And this is typical with their propositions. They tend to pass by a large percentage, as this one did, of the voters. And what Proposition 12 does is regulate production of pork is the big concern for Ohio, but also veal and eggs, establishes housing standards for those animals. And the focus of this case that many of you may have read a short blip about in Ohio Country Journal is the pork. So for hogs, it begins December 31st. So starting in 2022, those sales of pork in the state of California have to be pork that comes from the young of sows who were not, it prohibits, and my wording's a little weird on the slide there, I'm sorry. It prohibits the sale of pork from sows that were not housed according to their confinement standards that they established in this proposition. And that's that kind of, the sow needs to be able to stand up and turn around. And that results in about these 24 square foot group type pen requirements for sows. And as we know here in Ohio, that's not common for many of ours to be housed in that way. So if the sows were not housed in that way, then the pork coming from those sows from their young cannot be sold in California. Well, the National Pork Producers and American Farm Bureau Federation challenged the constitutionality of that proposition. and they brought that case in federal court earlier this year. There was a decision, actually I think they filed the case in December of last year, but there was a decision in April on that challenge, and the federal district court said, no, we're dismissing your challenge. We're dismissing this case because this is not a burden on interstate commerce. It regulates both the in-state production of pork and out-of-state production equally. And typically in these dormant commerce clause cases, there needs to be a difference between in and out of state. You need to be preferring your own state to the detriment of other states, and that's where the burden on interstate commerce would arise. But the court said, that's not the case here. All hog producers are treated the same, regardless of whether they're in California or elsewhere. And then there was a second argument that the parties made, saying that it burdened interstate commerce because of the economic burdens that it placed on producers. And again, the court said, no, we're not accepting that argument. We don't see a substantial burden here, because if you don't raise your sows that way, you don't have to sell your meat in California. You can sell it elsewhere. It's not forcing you to make that change or completely depriving you of your markets. So no burden there. Well, the National Pork Producers and American Farm Bureau Federation did file an appeal, and that's why we saw that article come up in Ohio Country Journal. They filed that appeal last week, so they're going to be challenging the court's decision on the Interstate Commerce Clause, and we'll have to see what happens with that.
Very interesting. And tracking that back to the sow, I would think would be a logistical nightmare.
Exactly.
So going to be very interesting. So something in today's world, something that's happening out in California could impact our producers here in Ohio. So we'll be keeping our eyes and our ears up on this one.
Hey, David.
Yes, and
go
ahead.
No, I was just going to ask you a question. Please go ahead.
Jump in there, Barry.
Well, this was relating to a previous subject, so if you have more to say on this, Peggy, please go ahead.
No, all I have to say, Barry, is that I was talking with a food law attorney yesterday, and a large part of her job involves tracking food coming in and out of California and making sure that her companies are not unintentionally violating many of the propositions that are in place in California. And so that's the concern here. Could hogs from Ohio end up getting into California unintentionally and violate the proposition? But something to note is there's very little enforcement of these propositions. There's some research going on in that regard, and some cases or some research reports that suggest that even though they have these propositions, it is hard to track, as you already noted, David, where that meat's coming from and whether that sow was housed correctly. So keep that in mind as well.
Okay, Barry, you had a question on one of the previous?
Yeah, it had to do with the environmental or the science-based panel of judges that you had talked about for the glyphosate issue, perhaps, I think.
Yes.
If they do form that, does that set precedent? I mean, I'm a little, I'm wondering whether or not, we start to get into some of these panels then for environmental issues down the road. Is that going to be the model for water quality issues, for climate change issues, and some of these things that might be a little bit more science-y than the regular run-of-the-mill case?
Right. It could somewhat set a precedent in that it's in a settlement process, but we do have a lot of mechanisms already in place in the courts where there is a very technical issue where a magistrate or a mediator can come in and oversee that technical issue. So we have that in place already in both federal and state courts, but you're right, this is slightly different. This is not just having them resolve the technical issue, but then also to determine whether these payments would be made based upon their resolution of the technical issues. So I think it is unusual in that regard. And whether this is something that could set a model for future settlements is a good question. So I'll be interested. I think that could be the holdup in the court approving this, is this science panel that would be established. The court may have some issues with that.
Great. So we don't have any further questions, so we're going to bounce to our next topic, and that is the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. Sign-ups are well underway. I was by our office yesterday, and the FSA is conducting business over the trash can out in the parking lot, and saw two of my producers getting signed up because they're not open to physical entrance into the offices yet, but the trash can out in the parking lot is making a great desk for them. So I salute our FSA partners and just the work that all of the staff across the state and country are doing, because they are doing these programs in ways that we never envisioned. To do signups over a trash can in the Coshocton County parking lot, to me, just blows me away, and I should have taken a picture of that to share that. But we're going to give this to Diane. Diane, you have an update on where we're at in signups, and thought we'd pass it your way.
Thanks, David. We have a number of slides, but we'll look at those fairly quickly. Showing on your screen now are two websites that are good for resources for this program. So our farm office website, the easiest way to find a number of materials about the CFAP program are to just type CFAP into our search box and go from there. And then the Farm Service Agency website, that farmers.gov/CFAP website is full of great information and resources for folks who want to sign up. So if you go to the next slide, please, David. Just a really quick recap. This program was generated through the CARES Act legislation, and its intention was to provide financial assistance to farmers that were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And ultimately, there are $16 billion available for assistance through this program, and where tomorrow will be 1 month into sign up. And so we're going to quickly look at how that sign up is looking here today. Farms should apply at their local farm service office. A lot of that work is being done virtually with some signatures in the parking lot or signed at the farm and scanned and sent into that office. But what we're going to focus on today is the progress of sign up. And on that USDA FSA website, farmers.gov, they do report every Monday about how sign up is going. So if we can go to that first slide, a big thank you to Ben Brown, who generated these slides with his handy little program. This first one looks at nationally how sign up has gone. And as of Monday, that June 22nd report, over $4 billion of payments have been processed. So some of those dollars are actually in the hands of the farmers who have signed up. Others have been approved and the applications were forwarded for processing. And those dollars were approved for over 252,000 producers across the country. So the way these what these maps are telling us is that those states that are shaded in red or orange, those are the states that have the highest dollars flowing that way. And you can really see the impact that's had on the Midwest and out in California and New York. There are a lot of dollars going into those states. But with that $4 billion that's been processed, that's 25% of the funds that have been designated for this program. So we'll quickly look at how these total dollars are divided among the different categories of commodities and livestock that went into making up this program. So the next slide, David, we're taking a look at specialty crops. And the darkest red states here are Florida and California, and they have received 64% of the payments that have been applied for and granted so far. $84 million of payments have been processed for specialty crops. And these were the crops that fruits, vegetables, types of crops. And there have been, Ohio's received $202,000 of those payments. There are 5 approved applications. So it could be that with those 5 approved applications, there's actually some more potential dollars that will go. So if they've been approved, that would include all the payments that are being generated for those applications. Our next slide looks at non-specialty crops. So these are for Ohio, primarily it's going to be corn, beans, malting barley, oats, canola, maybe a little wool. So far nationally, we've got over $1 billion in payments that have been committed for the non-specialty crops, and Ohio has received $22 million, $22.7 million of that allocation, with 4,282 approved applications. And when we look at Ohio's applications, I'm not going to add them up and say this is how many applications there have been to Ohio, because there are farms that will have made application to multiple categories of the CFAP program. So again, a lot of dollars in the upper Midwest so far going into the non-specialty crop categories. Our next category is dairy, and here the big dollars have gone to some of our biggest, obviously, dairy producing states: Wisconsin, California, New York. Ohio's in the top 20 of dairy states, so it's not surprising that 25 million of the 895 million that applications have been approved at this point are in Ohio. Those 590 applications that have been approved for Ohio represent about 1/3 of Ohio's dairy farms. So we still have a ways to go. It's unlikely that we'll have 100% application there, but it'll certainly go higher than 1/3. And then our final category, and the one that has committed or dispensed the largest proportion of dollars so far, is that livestock category. And you can really see the center of the United States is bright red. And that's where the largest amount of dollars have gone for the livestock. So here we're talking cattle, yearling sheep and lambs, hogs, as well as cull dairy cattle, dairy beef, cull heifers. So almost $2 billion, almost half of the dollars so far have gone in this livestock category. And in Ohio, there's over 2,600 approved applications totaling $24+ million going into the livestock section. So finally, want to note that if you as a farmer or folks that are working with farmers have clients who have not yet looked at this program, they should do that. There is an excellent tool here at the farmers.gov website. This is the same tool that they're using in the county offices, but if a farm can pull this up and go through it and prepare, be ready with your information and documentation. So I know earlier we'd said that documentation wouldn't necessarily be needed right away. Per the rules, they will need to provide documentation. Those local offices have to sign off on these applications, and they'd like to see the documentation and request that you have the documentation of those sales. So they do have until August 28th to sign up for that program. They can apply at any USDA Farm Service Agency center, and they need to call before they meet in the parking lot. So those applications can be done online. They can be downloaded, signed, and submitted by mail, fax, or other electronic means. And that communication with the office during that process is critical. That tool, that spreadsheet is a really important part of that application process. So we hope that farms take advantage of that. Because as we look at Ohio, there's already more than $72 million of these total categories that we looked at that's making its way into Ohio's rural economy. And that certainly will have a positive impact at the farm level and in the communities those farms are in.
We did have a question come through the chat from Chris. He had a farmer ask him today if there could be a second round of payments for 2020 production, specifically on this fall's feeder calf crop and prices remaining depressed. So I know that's a crystal ball question,
Yeah,
a political
that is.
question. I don't know, Diane, if you want, or Ben, you're sitting there scratching your head. Maybe we don't want to commit to an answer on this one.
Diane, do you have an answer? I'll let you go first.
Well,
I do have some thoughts on this.
I don't have a crystal ball answer, but this particular program is focusing on the first 2 quarters of 2020. So if there is something available, it would be in addition to this program. Anything else, Ben?
So Peggy made the comment earlier that if she was to go back to private practice, she'd go into litigation. I think for any of those out there that are looking for jobs, I think trade law is a really great area right now. There's a lot of demand. And the reason I bring this up is the U.S. has an agreement with the world that we will only supply our producers $19 billion worth of funds a year to support ag products. And the reason we do that is we don't want other countries to start subsidizing their producers to basically build market share. We don't like it when other countries do it. They don't like it when we do it. So we all have an agreement basically on how much we're willing to give our farmers based on actual production, right? So if you think, and we're going to talk about the ARC County and PLC programs here in just a second, they're what we call decoupled or detached from production, meaning that if you get money, it doesn't incentivize what you plant. It might keep you in operation longer, but it's not going to incentivize corn over soybeans. However, if you think about this program, CFAP, it is directly tied to a specific commodity, whether that's corn, soybeans, beef, dairy. It's directly tied to a specific commodity, and we use about $8-9 billion a year already on commodity specific support. Think sugar. Sugar is one of those that adds up. Dairy adds up, and then crop insurance, because crop insurance is directly tied to the unit you produce, right? And so we use a substantial chunk of that 19 billion already. Well, then you throw $16 billion of CFAP on top of this, plus what we had left over from the market facilitation program. Keep in mind, MFP was also a commodity specific tied program. And all of a sudden, we've blown past our $19 billion in commodity specific support. And so if you remember a couple of weeks ago or a month ago, maybe I talked about, I don't know how we're legally going to get this through the World Trade Organization in terms of, it's difficult for me to see, but I'm not a lawyer and I'm kind of stepping into Peggy's realm here. So I apologize, Peggy, but it's one of those things that we have now been sued. The U.S. government has had, just last week, they had court cases on this. We have been sued by all of our trading partners saying that this program, this CFAP program, is out of guidelines. And the U.S. government is now saying, hey, it's within guidelines because it's for last year's production. It was for last year, and producers aren't going to make decisions. They can't get more benefits by producing more because it's retroactive in a way. And that's how the U.S. government is now saying, hey, this is legal. However, what this ultimately does is now the question about looking forward and looking ahead. The U.S. government has made it possible for $14 billion, billion with a B, to come available here in the next 5 days, at the beginning of July. That'll become available to produce, for the U.S. government to create a new program. And there's kind of the expectation that any additional funds, whether that comes through Congress or whether that comes through the already authorized Commodity Credit Corporation, will be for the 2020 production year. And this is where it gets a little tricky, because I think now with all this attention, I mean, we're throwing big dollar figures that are drawing attention globally. And so I think there's a lot more attention placed on the United States now, that I think the U.S. is going to have to be very careful about laying out a program that draws basically the the angst of our trading partners around the globe. Now, what does this mean going forward? This is where I go back to, now would be a really great time to be a trade lawyer, because I think there's going to be a lot of demand. To me, what it looks like is we're slowly moving towards, disbanding the World Trade Organization Appellate Board, which is basically, if all these countries sue the United States for our, for our practices that we're, our subsidies we're giving farmers, and the court will then rule against us. That's what I see happening, is we're going to be found in violation. But then the U.S. is just going to appeal it. Well, there's no appellate board right now. It's completely defunct. And so the U.S. is going to appeal this, and it's just going to sit in, kind of in limbo for a while. And so, do I think the U.S. is going to get fined for this? Yeah, I think they're going to be found in violation. But as far as is there going to be a stick with that, I don't know. And so depending on how this looks going forward, I think that becomes a little bit challenging. So my answer, you got the two-handed economist answer, but my answer would be I do expect some form of program moving forward, just based on conversations and attention that's been given by USDA and Congress as to what it'll look like and when it'll be. That's another really good question. If the U.S. continues to promote and propose these, that they were retroactive policies and they didn't influence production, they'd have to wait till next year to do that. So I don't know. The short answer is I don't know. I do think it's now under greater attention than what it was before. Peggy, do you have anything to add? I don't know if you follow trade law, but
I've been following a little bit. I agree with you, Ben. I think some of it, not all of CFAP is subject to that criticism, but from what I've read, there is a lot of concern that we have gone beyond on some of these. So I think that would dampen the possibility of additional payments. I agree completely.
And just for transparency, my quick math, in terms of how much commodity specific support has been spent in 2020, it adds up to roughly $26 billion. So 26 billion is over our 19 billion. So we're 7 billion over. And keep in mind, we're keeping, we're pulling some of that 2019 MFP program into 2020 because it was paid in this fiscal year. So thanks. All right, David, is this my cue to go on?
Yeah, your cue is first to take off that Kansas City Royals sweatshirt that you put over that nice Ohio State shirt there. But apparently you're signaling that baseball is alive and well in the United States, and you're
we
anxious
hope
for your
so.
Royals to get back.
I certainly hope it's alive and well. I miss baseball, but it's cold in my house.
That's sorry, maybe you're cold. So we're going to give a quick ARC PLC reminders, and then Richard, I see your question coming through, and next on deck is we're gonna talk about the CARES Act. So we've got a question there that Barry and Peggy are looking at. But Ben, give us a rundown on ARC PLC because we're in the home stretch on that.
Yeah. And this is just going to be real quick. I have a couple of deadlines related to ARC County and PLC. So these are the government commodity Title I programs. These are the ones that are associated with the Farm Bill. So if you've heard any discussions about Farm Bill the last couple of years, this ties into it as well. As a reminder, the 2020 ARC County and PLC contracts need to be signed by next Tuesday, June 30th. This is, again, there's no election, there's no decision. All you have to do is go in and sign your paperwork. So we had the big push last March, up to March. It was this winter. You might have seen us. We did 173 meetings across the state. Hopefully we got to a lot of the producers and saw a lot, or at least got the word out in terms of the decisions that need to be made. This is not a decision. There's no election. You just have to re-sign your paperwork. You have till September 30th, however, to update your price loss coverage yields. And I've just been encouraging folks that while you're in getting signed up for the PLC 2020 program, to go ahead and update your PLC yields while you're in there. And so we've got a couple of slides to talk about this, but I first want to just kind of retouch back on that contract that needs to be signed by June 30th. Most of you, or most of your producers, or if you're a producer, or if you advise producers, most of them went in and signed their 2019 contract sometime this last winter. They had the option, the window was open to sign up for the 2020 contract. However, some FSA offices, just due to the sheer volume of people they had to get through, weren't really worrying about 2020. They were just looking at 2019. So there are some people that still need to sign your 2020 contract. Also, if you've made any changes to your farm operation, you've changed rental agreements, you passed some land to maybe a son or daughter, niece or nephew or something like that, you'll have to re-sign that contract again. And then again, for those producers that want to do a yield update in 2020, the software automatically kicks you out for 2020 so you can update your PLC yields. So if you've already updated your PLC yields, just call in and check. Just call your FSA office, Farm Service Agency, and just say, hey, have I signed my 2020 contract? And they'll be able to tell you whether you have or not. And just for transparency, so you know I'm not harping on you all and not doing the same thing for my family, I made my dad call. I sat there and watched him call the FSA office and asked to make sure he had signed up for his 2020 contract. And the reason for this really, and the reason it's kind of important, is we're looking at some decent sized Ark County and PLC payments, somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 to 40 bucks an acre next year. And these will be made in the fall of 2021, so October of 2021. But you're looking at 35 an acre, that starts to add up after a while. So just make sure you sign that contract to make sure everything goes all right. And we've got some tools to help out with this. Again, there's no decision on the 2020 enrollment, but for those of you that want to update your PLC yields, we do have some decision tools available on our website, and I've got it listed there. And then David, if you go to the next slide, please. Maybe, there we go. So just a reminder about these PLC yield updates. And again, you have till September 30th. So I don't want to make it sound like you need to do your PLC yield update. But we did get a postcard. FSA sent postcards out. And so we've been getting some questions about what actually is this. And we talked about this quite a bit this winter. But the yield update allows you to update your farm yield that's assigned to your operation. This is based on historical yields. Basically, a higher yield on your farm, if the program triggers at some point, it triggers a bigger payment. And FSA will always take the higher yield. So if your update is lower, if you've had lower yields the last couple of years than what you did previously, they'll leave it alone. They won't shrink your yield. So it's to your benefit to update your yield, or at least check, to update your yield if possible. Again, yield updates aren't allowed every farm bill. And so the way I like to tell people is if you get a chance to update your yields, you should do it. And especially if it gives you a higher, because there's no guarantee that there's going to be a yield update in the future. And I like to use that 1985 kind of as the example. We went almost 20 years without a yield update, and then we've had some since then, but we went almost 20 years from 85 to 2002. Again, just humor me and check, and encourage your folks to just check with their FSA office on their yields. It's the most easiest, simplest program, or in terms of decision possible. If you have a higher yield due to your past yields, you'll take the update. If it's lower, they're just going to leave it alone. So again, there's no penalty to check and do it. And then, once you update and once we get through that September 30th deadline, those farm yields will stay with you throughout this program and any other programs. It has been, in the past, we've had some disaster programs that have become available where they've actually paid out on the farm yield as well. So it's not just farm bill programs here. It could be other programs as well. But again, you have till December 30th. And this is a landowner's decision. So you might farm some land, but it is your landowner's decision to update the PLC yields, because they'll stay with the actual physical land. If you have power of attorney for your landowner, that'll work. You can sign off for them and that'll cover it. But your landowner will probably get the card, which is kind of interesting because in some cases, it's the landowner that gets the card, doesn't do anything with it, throws it away. The land tenant would like to update, or they have the yield. So there is, in some cases, a conversation that needs to be had because the owner needs the yield. And then not all farmers, so if you got a piece owned by, let's say, 10 cousins, only one of those cousins has to sign off on the land or the update. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. We got all this on our website as well as a webinar this, but just wanted to put that out there and keep you updated. David, would you mind going to the next slide, please? That's it. I think I'm done.
There we go. Yeah, that's a quick update on ARC and PLC. So next, it seems like every 2 weeks when we come, we always come here together on Farm Office Live. We have something about the Paycheck Protection Program and more rules and more interpretation of the rules that are there. So Peggy and Barry, we're gonna drop this your way to give us an update on this.
Yeah, thanks, David. I guess I'm going to kick it off just to talk about some of the things that have happened here in the last couple of weeks. And Peggy, I think, is going to talk next about forgiveness and the calculations, perhaps. But we've been talking about this for forever, it seems like. And I'm sure some of you are probably weary of the discussion about the Paycheck Protection Program, a term that we didn't even know existed until the CARES Act was passed. And the CARES Act implemented this particular program to help small businesses navigate this problem with COVID-19 and all the economic fallout. So a big part of it was to, as the title says, is to protect paychecks. And that was implemented, and we've had numerous edits and revisions and other laws passed and interim final rules, IFRs. So we have more and more acronyms to deal with too. And we had a new smaller act passed on June 5th, Paycheck Protection Program, the Flexibility Act. And during our last Farm Office live visit program, we discussed most of the key ingredients or the key pieces of that act. Since then, there have been a couple of IFRs, interim final rules, one on June 16th, that provided revisions to a couple of other IFRs. So if it's not complicated enough, you have to start referring to other IFRs. And then we have new applications, revised loan forgiveness applications for those of you who received a paycheck protection loan or you have clients that did. So we have now two possible forgiveness applications. One is the long form, if you will, or the traditional form that was tweaked slightly from before due to the Flexibility Act passage, and also a shorter easy application. So it does provide a little bit less, I guess, impact to your time. So hopefully it's going to be a little bit easier for those of you who meet those qualifications. And then we had another IFR, interim final rule, that was just put out June 22nd that provided a little bit more clarity. And these IFRs are really just providing clarity to the actual acts that are passing. So providing more flesh, just fleshing out some of the things that the acts actually say, but don't necessarily give detail on. And then the Small Business Administration also has a set of FAQs that they continually update. So if you're curious, and if we don't answer all of your questions here today on the PPP, you can revert to those particular pieces of information. So that's kind of where we're at as far as the timeline of what's happened here in the last couple of weeks. And so there's new guidelines essentially, and we've got more guidance, so it's helpful for all of us. So Peggy, I'm gonna let you go. I think you've got the next slide.
Yes, thanks, Barry. So some of the new guidelines coming out of the Flexibility Act that are now in one or two of those interim rules recently posted have to do with clarifying the amount eligible for forgiveness. And we knew that there were changes in that act. So SBA has taken a closer look and made some clarifications about determining some of these costs that would be eligible when the borrower makes that forgiveness application. So part of the clarification came from extending from an 8-week covered period to a 24-week covered period. Although the borrower, I always struggle to say that word, I apologize, can choose to stay with an 8-week covered period based upon the amount of their loan. But they did clarify that those payroll costs, there's a requirement in the original law of $100,000 per employee is the cap. And so if we're looking, that's on an annual basis though. So if we're looking at the 8-week period, that comes out to $15,385 is the max that could be covered in forgiveness for one employee. And clarification then, if we're looking at a 24-week covered period, then that maximum would be $46,154. And then we can add to that those healthcare costs and payroll taxes paid by the employer and retirement contributions. So there are some limits on those contributions now established in the clarification if we're dealing with self-employed or general partners or those owner employees of S Corps. So again, it's a lot for us to explain here right now, but we do at least have that guidance. If you want to go to the Department of Treasury's site and find the, excuse me, the interim rules that Barry mentioned, they lay those out in more detail. There's also clarification on the amount eligible if you're going under the owner compensation replacement. And so a lot of confusion there on how to calculate those numbers based on the extension from an 8-week to a 24-week possible covered period. And so we've got the numbers now. That number remains the same for owners, the $15,385 if you're going under 8-week period, but it's going to be restricted to actually 2.5 months out of 12 months for if you use the 24-week period, and that would be a maximum of $20,833. So we finally had that clarification. A lot of questions were raised on that issue. And then also, mortgage interest, those non-payroll costs such as mortgage interest, rent payments, utility payments, those are eligible for forgiveness, but to the extent that they would be deductible as those types of business payments on Schedule F. But we want to point out that they're not actually deductible if forgiven, but that's the parameter that SBA has established. If they would be deductible, that's the extent of those non-payroll costs that can be thrown into your forgiveness calculation. I explained this all on a post that we posted yesterday on farmoffice.osu.edu in the Ohio Ag Law blog. We go through this in a little bit more detail, but just to give you an idea, there is some additional language guidance there now to deal with some of these issues. Okay, back to you, Barry.
Yeah, just one thing I guess that I feel is the most important about the paycheck. Well, one of the more important things about the Flexibility Act is this 24-month period of this covered period that people can take advantage of post June 5th. Those folks that received their loan before June 5th, they have, I think, the option of the 8 or 24 weeks. It's post June 5th that it's 24 weeks only. But the 24 weeks allows sole proprietors and other folks that are that receive loans based on their owner compensation replacement to essentially receive full forgiveness. This allows more flexibility. It's not something they had the possibility really to attain with the 8-week covered period. With the 24-week covered period, that $20,833 limit, if you will, allows them, for the most part, to gain full forgiveness. So that I think is an important piece for those that are sole proprietors, for those that are self-employed and were receiving loans, sizing their loans based on the owner compensation replacement. So to me, I think it's a big deal for those folks. And yeah, well, we can talk more about that, I guess, towards the end. But David,
Barry and Peggy, 2 questions there. Are there still funds available? Farmers who have not participated, is there still applications being able to be had or applied or put in?
Yes.
Okay. And the second one is national media suggesting that sole proprietors must write themselves a check in order to show that they were paid for this reimbursement purpose. Is this correct? Yes or no?
Yeah, we've got that in a couple of slides where I'm going to address that a little bit more. But,
okay, so hang on. We'll hang on to that one then.
And yeah, till the end of this month. So they have 5 days, at least according to the law as it is written now. Now, there may be changes that we see here in the next month where they reopen it again. All the money hasn't been used, but the drop dead date that we know right now is the June 30th. So if they're going to submit an application, they need to get on it very quickly, because lenders have to move that through their process, and
Right.
the quicker the better, I think.
And is there a method for choosing the 8 or 24 week forgiveness period, or does it default to the 24 week? Was another question that came through.
At this point, it defaults
To the 24?
to the 24. Yeah. Prior to the June 5th date, those folks that received loans then could choose the 8 or 24 week.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we just have a couple of other things. One of the things that came out recently with this Flexibility Act and with the IFRs, the interim final rules, one of the questions is would borrowers, if they did select the 24-week covered period, would they have to wait until the end of the covered period to be able to submit their forgiveness application? And we found out that they don't, so that they can do that in the interim. So if they get to week 18 and they've spent all of their money and of their loan, then they could go ahead and submit that application for forgiveness. So that's something that's important, I think, for some folks. That's the first point that we make here. The second point here is that what I've already mentioned before. We have 2 new forgiveness applications that comply with the Flexibility Act. There's the full application, and then there's the short form, if you will, the easy application that's listed. And you can use the 3508, this form 3508 easy application, if you meet certain standards or certain criteria, and there are 3 of them. You have to meet one of them. So there are 3A, if you are self-employed and you have no employees, or you didn't reduce salaries or wages for employees by more than 25%, and you didn't reduce numbers or hours of employees. Or the last bullet there, you didn't reduce salaries or wages by more than 25%, and you experienced reductions in business activity as a result of the health directives related to the COVID-19 that perhaps made you reduce hours or employees. So this, for many of our farmers, especially those folks that submit an application based on owner compensation replacement, this easy application will probably be what you get to fill out. Now, it's not that easy. It is shorter, but the name may be a little bit misleading. There's still some requirements there for you to go through with your lender and submit information, but it is easier and shorter than the long form. So let's go to the next bullet. I know we're short on time, or the next slide, I'm sorry. And here's our wishy-washy answer to the question that was posed as far as whether or not self-employed people may need to write a check to themselves. There's a lot of disagreement. There's no real clarity, even with the IFRs that have been authored as a result of the Flexibility Act. There's nothing really straightforward out there through Treasury or SBA, at least what I've seen, that requires a self-employed person to write themselves a check for them to receive loan forgiveness. However, I think it's probably the safe play. So even if you're a little bit uncertain, and we are, I think it's probably the safe alternative to go ahead and write yourself a check for the amount that you're requesting forgiveness for. It even can be deposited probably back into the same account. So it doesn't have to be too complicated. But that's kind of where I am right now. And I don't know, Peggy, do you have any other thoughts on that particular point? There's just not real clarity.
Yeah, I don't think it hurts to do that. So
Yeah.
it might help.
Why
But
not?
the original review by the lender, I think, will give you that answer. They might require it at that step before it goes on to the SBA. So it is a good question to raise with your lender.
That's probably the best point. Yeah. working with your lender closely. Use their guidance. There's been some discussion about some safe harbor. Some of the banks are pushing for this. So in other words, if you have a PPP loan under a certain amount, your sizing amount was under, for instance, $150,000, then you would be granted forgiveness without submitting an application. So this is not the law, just repeat right now, but this is being discussed. So I don't know that we will even have any kind of safe harbor, but just to give you an idea of the ongoing discussions about what's going on around this Paycheck Protection Program. And the last point that I'll just make, and Peggy's already alluded to this, the portion of the loan that is forgiven, the Paycheck Protection Program loan that's forgiven, those particular pieces are not tax deductible when you go to file your 2020 taxes early next year. So all of those expenses are not tax deductible. So that's still ongoing discussion as well. And we don't know yet whether there will be any success as far as getting that to be tax deductible. Many in Congress are stating that, the original intent of the original CARES legislation was to have those expenses be deductible. So I'll end my comments there, and Peggy, you can offer anything else that you have. Sorry.
No, that's good. That's all from me, David.
Beautiful. I think if I'm checking the chat box and the Q&A, it looks like that we're okay on questions. I think that we resolved all those. Richard, if we didn't get your questions that you have in the chat, go ahead and type them in so we can see if you had some additional turnover on that. Barry, while you're here, let us, I think we're gonna hold the renewable. Ben, is that what you wanna do? Hold it, or you wanna go? We're gonna hold the renewable fuel standards until our July 15th session, just so we don't shortchange that any. You want to talk about the OSU income tax schools that are coming up, and then we're going to bounce it to Ben to talk about another webinar that folks might want to get onto as well.
Yeah, David, I didn't get this slide sent to you. I apologize, but we have our summer update coming up, and I'm not sure can I share my screen? I probably can't, can I?
I think you have the ability.
Oh, well, let's not go through that right now. Well, do you want me to try real quick?
You're more than welcome to try. With technology.
It's telling me I can't. So this is my mistake for not getting this done. But we have a summer update, tax update coming up, and it's going to be August 13th. And I'll share this at our next Farm Office live session as well. But it's primarily for tax professionals, but it's also for the lay person if you want more advanced tax topics. It's 10 to 3:30 on August 13th. It's a webinar. Our main instructor will be John Lawrence, who's one of our instructors for our tax schools, our professional tax schools in the fall. We're going to be talking about a lot of these Paycheck Protection Program loan issues, the CARES Act provisions, the tax provisions related to the CARES Act, dealing with the IRS. And we're going to primarily focus on S-corps and partnerships and some of the hot topics that are revolving around those. And also just some other issues, kind of ordinary but complex issues related to S-corps and partnerships, excess distributions, basis, inside-outside basis, which is becoming more important as the IRS tracks that a little bit more closely. So if you have an S-corp or a partnership, in particular, you may be interested in this particular webinar. So that's again, August 13th, 10 to 3:30. And you can find information on the Farm Office website through our tax tab. So thanks, David.
And Peggy, we put that in the chat box so everyone could see, the attendees and the panelists. So we got that so you can see that. Ben, let's talk about your webinar you and Aaron Wilson are going to put on next week.
Yeah, and so I'll just pop this up here, actually. Let me move this over. Yep, so we're going to do a webinar and basically a summer grain market and weather outlook. We've been getting asked a lot of questions related to dryness in the West and the impact on yields, and Aaron's been following that pretty closely. I talked to Aaron, if not daily, multiple times a day, And we kind of discussed this issue. Part of the reason why we chose next Tuesday, June 30th, is the day to kind of run through these numbers, is that's the day we'll get the acreage estimates from USDA in terms of how much corn and soybeans is out there across the country. Obviously, then weather takes a big part of the function in terms of what those yields look like come fall. But right now, to give you a little cliff note, the outlook's not overly rosy for higher prices come fall. We're going to need to see a pretty big production shortfall to see some prices rise. It is getting dry in certain parts of the country. There are spots where it's getting dry. Ohio has several of those spots where it's getting real dry. It was real dry in the Western Corn Belt. We got some rain this last week that's helped the crops out there. And so we'll just be doing a simple acreage outlook and then weather, talking a little bit about yield and then what that all means for prices come fall. Start maybe that conversation about looking at some opportunities to market some grain and just kind of be aware of where we sit on things. So that's what we got. And we welcome anybody to join us. You do have to register, so you won't get a reminder email like you did this morning from this webinar series. You'll have to re-register again at that gosu.edu/2020 Ag Outlook. So we'd welcome anybody to come join us and share in the fun. So thanks, David. Appreciate it.
And that's an amazing picture. Ben, you have a poll question you'd like to pull up? Do you have one?
Well,
or
hold on. I
just
gotta
an
figure.
exit?
Yeah, there's an exit survey. I got to figure out how to get back to my meeting controls. There we go.
And while you're doing that, Ben, as you're pulling it up, I just want to remind all the attendees, number one, thank you for being here today. But secondly, that our next Farm Office Live is going to be not on a Thursday, but a Wednesday, July 15th at 9 a.m. Again, you can register for that at the Farm Office Live. Just go.osu.edu, and then that /Farm Office Live. You can register there for that. But again, that is a date change, as a day of the week change, Wednesday, July 15th. That is about 2 weeks. So we thought that would be perfect to bridge the middle of July. Okay, Ben.
David. Oh, and just a reminder, I couldn't get the polls to come up, but just a reminder that for folks that have been receiving automatic RSVPs from this webinar series, they'll have to re-register for the next Farm Office Lives because our subscription ends here. So this is the last one of this series. We're switching dates and moving to a different time period, so people will have to re-register.
Great. And with that, are there any closing comments from Diane, Barry, Peggy, Ben? And we should say, Robert, we appreciate you being on today to talk about CAUV and to give us an update on that. We do appreciate you jumping in and being our guest, our special guest for today. Panel, anything? All right, just a reminder, you see it on the screen, July 15th, 9 to 10:30 a.m. You can register for that, and we just appreciate all of you being here today, and just hope you all have a great week and look forward to a great 4th of July celebration. With that, thank you, everybody.